Continuing the freeing of the waters in Jessie L. Weston's From Ritual to Romance. That this last shield, in an eastern land under a tropical sun, became a point of supreme importance. Is easy to understand. There is consequently small cause for surprise when we find throughout the collection the God who becomes upon them the much desired boon to be the one to whom by far the greater proportion of the hymns are addressed. It is not necessary here to enter into a discussion as to the original conception of Indra and the place occupied by him in the early Aryan pantheon, whether he was originally regarded as a god of war or a god of weather. What is important for our purpose is the fact that Indra, to whom a disproportionate number of the hymns of the Rig Veda are addressed, that is, from him the much desired boon of rain and abundant water is besought, and that the feet which above all others redounded to his praise and is ceaselessly glorified, both by the god himself and his grateful worshippers, is precisely the feat by which the Grail heroes, Gawain and Percival, rejoice the hearts of a suffering folk, i.e., the restoration of the waters to their channels, the freeing of the waters. Now, let's not think that just because tribal associations have been made, that limited forms have been claimed, that particular names like Indra don't refer to the god. Tradition relates that the 7 great rivers of India had been imprisoned by the evil giant Vritra, or Ahi, whom Indra slew, thereby releasing the streams from their captivity. The Rig Veda hymns abound in references to this feat. It will only be necessary to cite a few from among the numerous passages I have noted. Thou hast set loose the 7 rivers to flow. Thou causest water to flow on every side. Indra set free the waters. Thou, Indra, hast slain Vritra. By thy vigor, thou hast set free the rivers. Thou hast slain the slumbering Ahi for the release of the waters, and hast marked out the channels of the all-delighting rivers. Indra has filled the rivers, has inundated the dry land. Indra has released the imprisoned waters to flow upon the earth. It would be easy to fill pages with similar quotations, but these are sufficient for our purposes. Among the Rig Veda hymns are certain poems in dialogue form, which, from their curious and elliptic character, have been the subject of much discussion among scholars. Well, using elliptics allows for it to be evocative in a different way. Professor Oldenburg, in drawing attention to their particularities, had expressed his opinion that these poems were the remains of a distinct type of early Indian literature, where verses forming the central and illuminating point of a formal and ceremonial recital had been farsed with illustrative and explanatory prose passages, the form of the verses being fixed, and that of the prose being varied at the will of the reciter. This theory, which is technically known as the Akhyana theory, as it derived its starting point from the discussion of the Suparnakanya Kiana tent won considerable support, but was considered by M. Sylvain Levy, who asserted that in these hymns we have the remains of the earliest and oldest Indian dramatic creations, the beginning of the Indian drama, and the fragments could only be satisfactorily interpreted from the point of view that they were intended to be spoken, not by a solitary reciter, but by two or more dramatis personae. J. Hertel, der Ursprung des Indischen Dramas und Epos, went still further, and while accepting and demonstrating the justice of this interpretation of the dialogue poem, suggested a similar origin for certain monologues found in the name collection. Professor Leopold von Schroeder, in his extremely interesting volume, Mysterium und Mimas im Rigveda, has given a popular and practical form to the results of these researches by translating and publishing, with an explanatory study, a selection of these early culture dramas, explaining the speeches and placing them in the mouths of the respective actors to whom they were presumably assigned. Professor von Schroeder holds the entire group to be linked together by one common intention, viz., the purpose of stimulating the processes of nature and obtaining as a result of what may be called a ritual culture drama an abundant return to the fruits of the earth. The whole book is rich in parallels drawn from ancient and modern sources and is of extraordinary interest to the folklore student. In the light thrown by Professor von Schroeder's researches, following as they do upon the illuminating studies of Benhard and Fraser, we become strikingly aware of the curious vitality and persistence of certain popular customs and beliefs, and while the two last named writers have rendered inestimable service to the study of comparative religion by linking the practices of classical and medieval times with those folk customs of today, we recognize through von Schroeder's work that the root of such belief and custom is embedded in a deeper stratum of folk tradition than we had hitherto realized, that it is, in fact, a heritage from the far-off parts of the Aryan peoples, sort of humanizing stories about what are considered to be gods. For the purposes of our especial line of research, Mysterium and Mimas offers much of value and interest. As noted above, the main object of these primitive dramas was that of encouraging, we may say, ensuring the fertility of the earth. Thus, it is not surprising that more than one deals with the theme of which we are treating, the freeing of the waters. Only that, whereas in the quotations above, the worshippers praise Indra for his beneficent action, here Indra himself, in propria persona, appears and vaunts his feat. I struck down Vitra. By the power of Indra, I had become so strong in fury. For all mankind, I set the rivers free, and the impersoned waters speak for themselves. Indra, armed with the thunderbolt, broke the way for us. He smote down Vritra, the encloser of the rivers. There is no need to insist further on the point that the task of the Grail hero is, in this special respect, no mere literary invention, but a heritage from the achievements of the prehistoric heroes of the Aryan race. Now, definitely, what were considered to be gods got grafted onto human heroes. But the poems selected by Professor von Schroeder for discussion offer us a further and more curious parallel with the Grail romances. In section 8 of the work referred to, the author discusses the story of Rish Yachringa, as the Mahabharata names the hero. We find a young Brahmin brought by his father, Vibhandaka, in a lonely forest hermitage, absolutely ignored of the outside world, and even of the very existence of beings other than his father and himself. He has never seen a woman and does not know that such a creature exists. A drought falls upon a neighboring kingdom, and the inhabitants are reduced to great straits for lack of food. The king, seeking to know by what means the suffering of his people may be relieved, learns that so long as Rishyachringa continues chaste, so long will the drought endure. An old woman who has a fair daughter of irregular life undertakes the seduction of the hero. The king has a ship or raft, there's versions of both, fitted out with all possible luxury, and an apparent hermit's cell erected upon it. The old woman, her daughter, and companions embark, and the river carries them to a point not far from the young Brahmin's hermitage. Taking advantage of the absence of his father, the girl visits Rishyachringa in his forest cell, giving him to understand that she is a hermit like himself, which the boy in his innocence believes. He is so fascinated by her appearance and caresses that, on her leaving him, he, deep in thought of the lovely visitor, forgets for the first time his religious duties. On his father's return, he innocently relates what has happened, and the father warns him that fiends in this fair disguise strive to tempt hermits to their undoing. The next time the father is absent, the temptress, watching her opportunity, returns and persuades the boy to accompany her to her hermitage, which she assures him is far more beautiful than his own. So soon as Rishyachringa is safely on board, the ship sails. The lad is carried to the capital of the rainless land. The king gives him his daughter as a wife, and so soon as the marriage is consummated, the spell is broken, and rain falls in abundance. Professor von... chaste is perhaps it's the right word, and the wrong word later in the story, because getting married and consummating marriage doesn't make you unchaste. Professor von Schroeder points out there is little doubt that in certain earlier versions of the tale, the king's daughter herself played the role of temptress. There is no doubt that a ceremonial marriage was frequently formed part of a fertility ritual, and was supposed to be especially efficacious in bringing about the effect desired. The practice subsists in Indian ritual to this hour, and their surviving traces to European folk custom have been noted in full by Mannhardt in his exhaustive work on Walt an Feldkult. Its existence in classical times is well known, and is certainly one of the living folk customs for which a well-attested chain of descent can be cited. Professor von Schroeder remarks that the efficacy of the rite appears to be enhanced by the previous strict observance of the role of chastity by the officiant. What, however, is of more immediate interest for our purpose is the fact that Rishyatringa story does, in effect, possess certain points of contact with the Grail tradition. Thus, the lonely upbringing of the youth in a forest far from the haunts of men is absolute ignorance of the existence of human beings other than his parent and himself present a close parallel to the accounts of Percival's youth and woodland life as related in the Grail romances. Well, certain things are done repeatedly, though, in different lands without connection. In Gerbert's continuation, we are told that the marriage of the hero is an indispensable condition of achieving the quest, a detail which must have been taken over from an earlier version, as Gerbert proceeds to stultify himself by describing the solemnities of the marriage and the ceremony blessing of the nuptial couch, after which the hero and heroine simultaneously agree to a life of strict chastity and are rewarded by the promise that the swan knight shall be their descendant, a tissue of contradictions which can only be explained by the maladroit blending of two versions, one of which knew the hero as wedded, the other as celibate. There can be no doubt that the original Percival story included the marriage of the hero. The circumstances under which Rishyatringa is lured from his hermitage are curiously paralleled by the account found in the Quest and Menacere of Percival's temptation by a fiend in the form of a fair maiden who comes to visit him by water in a vessel hung with black silk and with great riches on board. In pointing out these parallels, I wish to make my position perfectly clear. I do not claim that either in the Rig Veda or in any other early Aryan literary monument we can hope to discover the direct sources of the Grail legend, but I would urge upon scholars is the fact that, in adopting by hypothesis of a nature cult as a possible origin and examining the history of these cults, their devotion, and their variant forms, we do in effect find every period and stage of development undoubted points of contact which, though taken separately, might be regarded as accidental. In their ensemble can hardly be considered when every parallel to our Grail story is found within the circle of a well-defined and carefully studied sequence of belief and practice, when each and all form part of a well-recognized body of tradition, the descent of which has been abundantly demonstrated. Then I submit such parallels stand on a sound basis, and it is not unreasonable to conclude that the body of tradition containing them belongs to the same family and is to be interpreted on the same principles as the closely analogous rites and ceremonies. I suspend the notice and discussion of other poems contained in Professor von Schroeder's collection till we have reached a later stage of the tradition when the correspondence will be recognized as even more striking and suggestive. And whether folklore or religion, certain things, humanity encounters certain things, certain miracles and stuff are needed, and then comes one that kind of combines them all, but has a wider reaching message than what is for one town, one tribe. Same basic stuff, one God and, certain basic ethics, but specifics for the area, not so much. Seasonal rites, not so much. That's not a requirement or a recommendation in this age, but can we say it's not something that's acceptable in a voluntary sense,